Thank you so much for inviting me here. Thanks, Sean. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about the ways in which preschool programming, and I'm going to talk specifically about universal pre-K as a strategy, provides us an opportunity to address the achievement gap. And it's really good I didn't put much about the achievement gap because that seems to have already been done for me, which is great. But I'm going to actually do something a little bit different today. It's sort of a mishmash of a bunch of things because I really want to challenge us a bit to think about new models of applied science that cross disciplines but actually allow us to maybe do what Eric was saying at the outset, which is maybe create change in achievement gaps, and we'll see whether you believe that this is an approach that might work. And I want to do so by talking about a partnership that Sibel Raver and I have been conducting with New York City's Department of Education, the early childhood group there that are launching universal pre-K, which has been a really tremendous, and I'll get to some of the numbers in a little bit on this, but by all intents and purposes, it's really a historic expansion of high quality pre-K through a program that they call Pre-K for All. In this talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about the foundation in developmental and neuroscience that would require us to focus or encourage us to focus on the preschool period, while also talking a little bit about both a prevention science and actually an education science perspective about how the foundation of the kind of work I'm talking about comes from randomized controlled trials. But the challenge that I'll raise for all of you is whether that work is going to be sufficient to change quality at scale. And I'm arguing it's actually not. The partnership work that we were doing initially was one where we were providing essentially tools and research knowledge to the city to help them build better data and a bit of a dashboard for decision making. It's morphed and developed over the last year where we're really now much more of what I would call a true partnership rather than sort of us trying to be helpful consultants, where we're together actually with the city now helping to build infrastructure to align quality with research-based practice. I'll give you some examples. This will be much more clear in a little bit. And what's neat about that is that our hope was it would allow us to start designing studies that we could do together that could answer the kinds of questions that the city was asking us. And that's actually where we are now, where we're actually in the midst of, literally, because I'm not attached to myself, hold on. Okay, now I'm getting on. Where we're actually literally in the midst of, as I'm getting emails as I'm sitting here, the city works very quickly about designing the kinds of studies that can help answer questions that's most burning to them. But from my perspective, this kind of partnership work, which is really hard work to do, and it's as hard or differently hard than a lot of the other work we regularly do or are trained to do, I think is going to help us make some inroads on the kinds of challenges that are facing low-income children around the world. So, but it's really about building science that's much more closely tied to policy and practice. So, essentially, a little bit of history. So Sibel Raver and I, when we got engaged in this, we, as many of you, had served for many, many years as PIs or co-investigators on randomized controlled trials. We had done some work in Chicago and New York City and nationally and elsewhere. And of course, many of you in this room have done much of that similar work. And what we found was that if we kept doing that work for a really long time, it just was painfully slow. And you would end a study after 5 or 7 or 10 years or some number of years and find at the end of the day you found that something worked or didn't work or how it worked, but it wasn't clear that that was going to have any inroads onto what actually was happening for real kids on the ground. And frankly, I was very worried that I would be very gray by the time, and maybe gray and not have had made any progress, gray-haired that is, without having made a major dent in what I thought were really important educational disparities that we needed to address. So it was really an opportunity to shift our priorities from one where we were asking the research questions to one where the first priority was asking the questions or answering or helping the city answer the questions that they wanted to answer, to advise them on design and data and analysis that was really about supportive of the partnership rather than putting our research questions as researchers front and center. So This work, obviously, so now a little bit of background. Of course, you know, I don't have to tell everyone in this room, although I don't know how many of you have experience in early childhood. This work obviously leverages a lot of advances that have happened over the last decade in neuroscience that argue that the brain architecture, of course, begins very early in life. This is a graph of synaptic connections that happen, that grow over the first 5 years and then start pruning with age, so that the system is trying to figure out what's important and what's not, right? And I'm not the expert in that, and there's many more in the room that probably are. And frankly, that the higher order cognitive processes in the 3 and 4-year-olds are here, right? Build on a foundation of learning that happens in the very early years, which I'm not going to talk about today, but would love to. But they really do, while they decline, they do set the stage for later learning. So it just becomes a very important period, and it ties into what Daphne was talking about with regard to why we think pre-K is so important. And of course, there's clear evidence from SES disparities. We've been talking a lot about the achievement gap here. Here's evidence of SES disparities from Sibel Raver's work on executive functions, where she finds with increasing chronicity of income risk, lower levels of kids' executive function, which we think forms the basis of their approach to learning. And the idea that if we get into this period of time, we can leverage the fact that, that there is sort of a declining brain plasticity, along with, in the blue, the period at which it takes more effort to actually change outcomes, right? So we're leveraging this exact moment here where there's lots of plasticity and hopefully not too much effort to change things, right? So that's the idea. So what evidence do we have that UPK matters? And Daphne talked a lot about this already. I'll just show you very quickly some findings from Chris Weiland and Hiro Yoshikawa's work in Boston that shows that universal pre-K does matter, and it does seem to matter when delivered at high quality, even at a full city level. These are some findings from some regression discontinuity work that they've done that show effect sizes of the Boston Pre-K program that was a combination of a literacy or a language intervention combined with a math intervention delivered at scale across the city that showed gains in kids' PBT scores, their language skills, their understanding of letters, and their understanding of numbers, and their math scores. I'm not showing you data that also showed improvements in their executive function skills. And the result is, when you turn that into standard deviation units on something that we all understand better, like SAT type units, because it's about a standard deviation gap, although maybe it's gotten a lot smaller over the last set of years, that the Boston Pre-K program, they've argued, reduces the achievement gap by about half. So we see some gains. Maybe it's smaller with some of the current things that are happening in families now. So the challenge has been that a lot of us have been doing this work rather than in large cities in randomized controlled trials, beautifully designed randomized controlled trials, and I've done some of this work as well, where we're trying to address the school readiness gap by training teachers to more effectively work with kids in classrooms. And these are largely studies where we've randomly assigned preschools to receive an intervention or not. And so this was one case where some work we were doing, I did in collaboration with MDRC. This was sponsored by the Department of Health and Human Services. We were trying to address the school readiness gap through randomizing centers to different social and emotional treatments. 3 different treatments in this case that we were trying to do across the country, across 17 different grantees, across the study. This was in Head Start centers. And essentially what this work shows, and frankly a lot of similar work has now been conducted, that this is just one of the models that we were testing, was that largely if we do this stuff right, if we train teachers, we give them a clear curriculum, we train teachers, and we work in classrooms with teachers. Coaches are working regularly and frequently in classrooms with teachers. We can actually move the dial both. In this case, it was on teachers' practice. Oh, everything got cut off. But basically, this program was a program called Preschool PATHS that was trying to teach teachers to more effectively deliver emotion-based instruction. So teaching a kid who may be aggressive because they misinterpret social cues, ways in which they can more effectively respond to emotions. Okay, I'll speed through. I'm good. And we found that teachers actually were much more effective at delivering, this says social emotional instruction, sorry about the cutoff in the thing. They weren't more effective in other areas of their instruction necessarily, and the result was that kids could recognize emotions better. They could recognize those same emotions when you told them stories about kids, when you asked them about how they might respond to an ambiguous situation like, hi, there was a kid and they walked by you and they bumped you and milk landed all over your brand new shoes. What are you going to do about it? When I asked my own kid when he was 4, he actually said, I'll punch him, which is not the right response. They actually encouraged, based on this program, more competent responses to that kind of an ambiguous story and fewer aggressive responses. But the challenge was, so we get really good effects on the things that we're teaching kids to do better, recognize emotions. No effects, though, on kids' executive function or transfer to pre-academic skills, even though as a developmental psychologist, I think these things are all linked. And also some questions about whether the effects would last long term. And that's been a huge issue in the area of preschool education that I won't get into a lot of now. And indeed, this study is one that is very similar to work that we've actually gotten really good at as developmental psychologists and education scientists studying programs in preschool. There's a number of different curricula now that have been shown to be effective in the short term when supported with teacher training and coaching in the language and literacy area, in the math area, and as in the PATHS program that I talked about in the social, emotional, and self-regulation realm. So we've gotten very good about how do you design a scripted program that teachers can handle, that can change, and this is what the but comes, that can change one set of outcomes for kids. But generally, these are sort of what I call single target interventions, right? So they tend to say, let's just change math, let's just change this, right? The other thing that I mentioned relatively quickly was that the effects tend to fade as kids enter a large number of varied quality kindergartens. So in that Head Start study that I described to you very, very quickly, we had 100 centers at the beginning. Kids went from those 100 centers to ×6 number of schools. So, and you tend to see that where kids go from one center to either 3 to 5 to 6 schools, 5 times, 6 times the number. So they're really getting widely dispersed, and you can imagine that intervention effects really do get diffused when kids are all mixed up with other kids who are joining new into the system, right? Really spread out to a diverse set of environments. And it's not clear, and this is the biggest point that I want to get to as I move into the next piece, is that any one of these particular interventions that have been tested in these beautiful randomized trials actually will work at all at scale, that any city can just adopt it and say go, right? And in part because there's lots of other asks on teachers. A school district is very rarely going to say, I only care about math, or I only care about social emotional learning for kids, right? They care about everything, of course, right? And frankly, there's a huge amount of constraints on resources and time for teachers. So the question then is, how do we go from here, from studies that show small effects in targeted areas to what works at scale? And what we've come to realize, or I've come to realize through this work, is that there's a number of ingredients to successful scale up. So some, the first set, really come from the work that I just described to you, the randomized controlled trials, where it combines the combination of probably a curriculum, some amount of training of teachers, and maybe even program leaders as well. That's likely to be important. Coaching, probably family engagement matters too, less research on that. But these two areas where we know a lot less is frankly been the subject of much of the partnership work that Sibel and I have engaged with the city, where we believe that part of a successful scale up is not just that you're doing something good in the classroom, but you're pairing it with a building of a research infrastructure for school districts or for cities or for states, where you're pairing with the collection of regular and ongoing data that cities can use or classrooms can use or sites can use that provides a sense of what's going on in the classroom, either teaching practice or in outcomes for kids, and allows them to identify areas of growth, challenge, et cetera, across classrooms, across sites, across the city, and complemented, and Sibel dubbed this term for our work, really building an infrastructure, or research architecture, as she would call it, for ongoing use of research and data embedded into daily practice. So let me tell you what that looked like. I will cut a little as I go, and I will speak quickly. So very fast on pre-K for all, just so you have a sense of the scale that we're working under. So the pre-K for all program launched by, under the de Blasio administration essentially it's huge and ridiculously large, right? So initially, back before pre-K for all, New York City provided pre-K services for 19,000 kids in the city. This past year, 68,000 kids were served in full-day pre-K programs. So that's, you know, the size of actually the entire Boston public school system, just to give you a sense. There are actually 1 million school kids in New York, so that's why these numbers are what they are just for pre-K. And more than triple, of course, the 19,000 kids that they started with just a couple of years ago. So very fast expansion of pre-K and in very large numbers. And when this happened in our backyard, Sibel and I and a set of other NYU faculty went in front of the city and said, how can we be helpful? And essentially they said to us, well, if you raise some money, we'd love to have you at the table to help out with us. So we went and raised some money. And what we did essentially was, and I'll do this very quickly here and get into more detail, was we launched a partnership that in the first year was really an add-on to an evaluation that they were conducting. So while they were hiring teachers and more social workers for classrooms, et cetera, we partnered with an outside evaluator that they had commissioned to embed some direct assessments of executive function actually into what they were already collecting to take the pulse of how pre-K was rolling out. What's moved to over the last year is, as I said, a true partnership, and I won't do it here because I'll do it again in a second in more detail. So the original goals, as I said, were really around developing the research architecture to provide, the idea was that the city needed tools to be able to monitor and assess how pre-K for all was rolling out. And that included direct assessments of how young kids were doing, the ability to link that data to the other data they were collecting already. And then we wanted to know whether, if we collected that kind of information, was the kind of thing that teachers collect themselves, right? It's no fun if they're not always going to be able to send a whole bunch of graduate students and other research staff out to tons of sites to be able to collect this kind of data. Can this be something that we could get into the hands of teachers and test basically the response, the feasibility of this kind of a rapid response data collection? And then we wanted to, and we only done a little of this, frankly, is present the findings graphically to the city so that they could see, not in a huge report and a whole bunch of tables, but actually in some visually accessible way, how the enrollment patterns looked, how kids are doing across the city. So for essentially, the notion was that, as I said, we couldn't go around always be sending researchers out to the city. So we wanted to start moving things onto tablets to collect, for easy to collect, quick turnaround, but still reliable data. So building on developmental research that have built out really important assessments. And we purchased tablets and loaded software from Yelena. Is Yelena here? Not anymore? Yes, thank you. Brilliant. Terrific Hearts and Flowers, who was incredibly generous and had built these great tasks for older kids, allowed us to adapt them for younger children. And it really was a terrific way to provide valid assessments, but with much, much lower error rates. And we got response time, too. So we really got more information from kids than we would have otherwise. And I'll show you in a second what we could do with those data in terms of expedited data entry. And then we kind of kept going with the whole tablet idea and added direct assessments of kids' cognitive skills as well. So I'm not going to show you the Hearts and Flowers task in the interest of time, and Yelena could probably tell you more about that than me anyway. We adapted the Woodcock-Johnson, which many of you know who study early childhood, as a task for kids' cognitive skills, but it also put that on tablet as well. Turns out we bought the pictures from the developers and got fees for single-use assessments. So we didn't change the pictures. We're using the original pictures from Woodcock-Johnson. Allowed kids to basically tap on the tablet as their answers to their questions. These are the math questions, right? How many balloons, or who's holding 3 balloons, or something like that. We collected lots of data. And what's neat about the collection of data on tablet is unlike those of you who've collected paper and pencil or direct assessments of kids all the time, you can analyze it super fast. So it got collected by Westat, which was the evaluation firm. It could be uploaded to them, switched over to us in a couple of days, ready for us. We cleaned it. And so within 2 weeks, we had data that we could present back to the city. And ultimately, what we'd like to be able to do is eventually link this to dashboards so a teacher could do it with a kid. And then it would come up with a little, like, you know, Fitbit-like thing, right? Kid's doing great, kid not so great, right? Something like that. And you could do something in the classroom as well. The data visualization we did was largely around mapping. So the city had a question of whether they were reaching all of their kids across neighborhoods. So here is a map that we developed for the city. Not a hard one, frankly. This is very, very simple descriptive work, where essentially we took all of the pre-K for all sites, mapped them onto the median income census data, median income by census tract. The red are the poorer neighborhoods, red and orange, the green are the higher income neighborhoods. There was data that was coming out that was suggesting that they were maybe reaching higher income families faster than lower income families. And when we showed them these data, they said, well, now we're not really so concerned, right? Because a lot of the orange and red areas are covered, right? There's lots of access to pre-K all over the place, right? And actually expansion, when it's neat, you can show where the old sites were and where the new sites were. For those of you who know New York City, this is Manhattan. A lot of the growth was in Manhattan, yes, in higher income neighborhoods. That's what a universal system is doing. In Staten Island, that had very little coverage before. And what was neat about it is the city could say, uh-oh, we worried about this neighborhood down here because it's low-income neighborhood, not as many sites. We mapped then that onto where young kids lived in the city, where 0 to 5-year-old children are, and it turns out no kids live down here. And areas like this is where Hurricane Sandy hit, and there's actually some challenges with infrastructure of building new places. So it allows the city to think about where they might need to start building some infrastructure and where they might have additional need. So very quickly, I'll end, because I'm probably running out of time, but I have a few more things. So essentially, the last year, we've shifted from this. We were providing tools and research advice to a real partnership. We did 2 major things that I'll highlight. One was last summer, they wanted to develop pre-K quality standards that they could map onto the data they were collecting in sites. So we shared research evidence with them that allowed us to link new quality standards with research literature, align them with existing systems that were already in place, link them to the kind of data they were collecting in sites, and then allowed them to create a set of standards that met a bunch of their objectives. And lately, over the last, 6 months or a few months or something like that, we've been actually working with them to develop both a framework but also a methodology for using some data they're collecting in sites already. They collected an initial snapshot visit every place, collect a little data. They collect quality data in sites on a rotating basis and use all of that information to think about how to allocate much more limited coaching resources. Right, so they can't go out once or twice a week like we could do in our randomized studies, but if we help them think about which sites might need the most help, they could create some levels of need across site by using the data they're collecting, and then also use it to assign what they were calling professional learning tracks, essentially different training modules for different sites, so that sites could really benefit from different kinds of programming. And now, which I've been really excited about, is we've gotten to the point that we are starting to develop joint research activities to support the Department of Education needs. So funding from the Foundation for Child Development has allowed us to launch a study where we're looking at social networks of teachers. How do they share information in a large system? All the information can't come from the city to teachers and to sites. It needs to also, we need to leverage the way teachers share information, and we need to understand how to do that. And then with work from the Spencer Foundation, I've been able to launch some efforts to understand, as they call it, the elasticity of class. How much are class scores going to change or be expected to change? So how can they track improvements? And especially related to some of their inputs that they're doing, their special training that they're doing that are focused on professional development of teachers. So in sum, and I'm over time, sorry, but essentially the idea here is that our perspective is that we really do need to eliminate the barriers from there's a gap between what we know works in randomized controlled trials that we all love doing and that tell us a lot, but it's not where we should stop. And we need to bridge the gap between what's happening in micro intervention and see how we can use that information to macro policy. It's not that the RCTs weren't important. They are incredibly valuable. If we didn't have that base of knowledge about what works, we wouldn't know what to do. But I think we've gotten almost as far as we can with that work in order to inform policy and practice at scale. And I think these kinds of research practice partnerships really provide an opportunity then to move the dial in the achievement gap. Building programs at scale, but that are now sensitive, because we're building it within the system, we're much more sensitive to what's happening, what the constraints are that they're facing, where they say, you know, we only have this many social workers. How do we distribute, right? Or other constraints that teachers are facing or the city is facing, as well as opportunities. But they really aren't easy, and I'm happy to talk later to folks. It does really require a shift in the way we work on a regular basis. They work much, much faster than we work, as academics work, and it's a challenge, I think, on both sides. But frankly, I think that it's a huge opportunity right now. I think that there are private funding agencies, as well as the federal government, IES in particular, that are really invested in supporting these efforts now. I found that agency leaders are really open to this. So I was just at a meeting with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, launching a whole set of, in New York City, launching a whole set of initiatives for infants and toddlers, and invited a whole slew of 20-odd academics across the city to say, how can we work together? That kind of work, I think, is happening now in other places as well. And of course, we have a lot to do for kids and inequality, so here's a way to start. So thank you very much.